time when a whole country, a regime in a whole country, as the Taliban are doing now, can make women disappear. They are not allowed to go to school, they cannot go to work, they cannot go to the hairdressers, they cannot even go to the national park. They cannot go outside the house without a man or a boy accompanying them. Imagine if that would be in the US. It would happen to you. And they are sort of out of the public eye, out of any decision making, or it's dead in slow motion, they say themselves. When this can happen, I think we really need to use the word feminist as well, because men and women should be the same rights, obligations, and opportunities.
Just a follow-up question, and that is with regard to the Security Council. Was it possible for them to understand that concept, which is sort of visual extent of feminist thinking? How did it actually go about it?
Well, it was important to sort of give it the content by defining what is it all about. And I would not make it an identity policy. I refused to do that because I think that would have taken us straight into a war. Instead of that, it's about rights. The women have the same human and legal rights. That's very easy. Secondly, are they represented? Are they around the tables where important decisions are being made? Do they have a seat? And thirdly, resources. The budgetary needs also go to meet the needs of women and girls. So nothing mysterious about this. Nothing that have to make you change your attitude. You just have to look at those things. Are women there? Do they have the same rights? Can they own a bank account? Can they have a right to say no to be married away at 15? Can they start a business? Can they enjoy exactly the same thing? And that was the way to define it. So, and I think we really put it on the agenda also of the Security Council. We made a month because we were consistent. And the ambassador was said, you made me every evening, wait for where are the women? Are they mentioned in the documents, in the resolutions? Are they there as briefers and, as leaders? So I think that we have things not good.
Thank you. And Claudia was distributed as a member of Foreign Affairs from 2015 to 2017. And this was at a time where the relationship had changed a lot between Mexico and the US. So country went from a Obama government to a Trump government. And there was a set, the country trading was. So, how did we actually, I guess when you see such a global change in the relationship to the most important neighbor, what was your initial thoughts?
Well, sometimes you have your own set of priorities, your agenda, the things you want to work on, and then reality sets in and imposes its own agenda. And that's what happened to me. I was a foreign minister for the whole duration of the electoral process in the United States. So we went from having a field of almost more than 20 wannabe candidates in the Republican field, to having Donald Trump as a candidate, to having him elected as president. So really the relationship between Mexico and the United States, which has never been easy, but we've managed to increasingly have more understanding of each other, to value one another as not only partners, we are each other's the first or second trading partner in the world. And we increasingly are part of the same production chains of value were become very integrated with the US and Canada because of the trade agreement that we signed in the early 90s. And we've learned also to value each other as allies as well, in dealing with security issues, in dealing with challenges we both face, such as migration challenges or arms trafficking in the region, and also as friends and partners in the international and multilateral stage. So we had this very functional, sometimes uncomfortable, but always valued relationship with the United States, and particularly a very productive binational relationship with the United States during the Obama administration. But as the campaign evolved, candidate Trump, or presumptive candidate Trump, started using an increasingly offensive rhetoric against Mexicans. And you know, Mexico has in the United States a large community of Mexicans living in the United States, 12 million. Of those, 6 million are there in irregularly. That means to say they don't have their migration status clear in terms of the law. So it's one of those tension points in our relationship. And Donald Trump started using our community as a punching bag to gain more support during the early phases of the campaign. Eventually, he won the nomination. And he started saying things like Mexicans are all rapists and criminals, and things like the free trade agreement, NAFTA, that we had with the United States and Canada, and that had since 1994, when it came into effect, really quadrupled investment in the three countries, created millions of jobs in the three countries, and accounted for the largest volume of trade in Mexico and the United States, Canada and Mexico, etc., was the worst deal ever. And he was going to denounce it as soon as he became president. So alarms were done. And I had to shift my priorities and focus on our community in the United States and on our relationship with the American people. That's why I said we have not only a bilateral relationship, but a binational relationship that is present in all aspects of our country's lives, not only government to government, not only in trade, but also culturally, also in the everyday lives of Americans, because Americans, for example, buy TVs or the cars that are largely made in Mexico or that are produced together with Mexico and Canada. We're part of the same chain of production, the three countries, for example. So we set up a very aggressive strategy of rebuilding our relationship with the American people. We recognize that in the years that we had the treaty, we had taken it for granted. We had taken its benefits for granted. And we had taken for granted that Americans knew how important Mexico is for its well-being, for its products, for its produce, for its meat, generally for its advancement and its growth. So I incorporated to traditional diplomacy, something that I'm very proud to have done, and that has remained part of Mexico's strategy since. That was a very aggressive public diplomacy strategy to complement traditional diplomacy efforts. So we went to the United States. I was there every week, 3 or 4 days a week in different states that no other foreign minister had gone before. I was in North Carolina, I was in Wisconsin, I was in Las Vegas and not playing, meeting with our community, yes, to reassure them that their government had their backs, that we were close to them, we would protect them, but also working with the authorities to have specific mechanisms so that our communities would feel protected, would have documents, would have the police not stop them unfairly or through discrimination, bias, or anything, but also with the business communities. And saying to the people in each of the states, Mexican investment here, and we have the numbers broken down to every one of the states in the United States, for every one of them. Mexican investment here, it creates so many jobs. And let me tell you, all of the states in the United States have Mexican investment that creates jobs. Some of them, the lesser ones, maybe 3,000 jobs. But in other states, millions of jobs the bilateral relationship is responsible for creating. So we talked about what it meant for the people in that specific state or city to be associated with Mexico through the North American Free Trade Agreement. What our community in that state or city was doing for its growth and its development in terms of culture, in terms of the sectors they worked in. And it was a wonderful experience to sort of educate not only the American people, but also the Mexican people of this patrimony that we had together and that we had to put into value in very vocal and assertive ways. We continue to work with the governments, different levels of governments, with the business community, but also, thank you, with society in general, the academic, it's the same. You need to take the talk also in artificial intelligence. But also with academia, with the cultural community. We just deployed a strategy, for example, through gastronomy. And we brought Mexican chefs to the United States to cook and with the produce that our workers help grow in the United States and things like that. So it was a very holistic approach and while keeping close to our community. We have the largest network of consulates in another country. I inaugurated the 50th. We now have 51. And an American friend told me when this was starting, and I told him, we're very worried. Our community is very scared because of the rhetoric and the threatening rhetoric that's, permeating the campaigns and what's going to happen. Are they going to be separated from their families? And he told me, how many consulates do you have? 49. You have prime real estate. You have to see your consulates, and that's what we do. Not only as places where our community went to have services, specific services related to the Mexican government, but as points from which we could promote Mexican interests and the Mexican-American narrative. And it was very effective. Throughout that, we managed to reassure our community, sign cooperation agreements with different cities and states in terms of the being friendly to our community, etc. And we also started working on making it possible, like the whole of the international community, for the UN General Assembly in 2016, unanimously adopting the Declaration of Refugees and Migrants. We said that's not enough. We really have to keep pushing the international community on the migration challenge. And we pushed for the UN system to start with the efforts that led to the Global Compact on a safe, orderly, and regular migration efforts. Mexico was one of the two co-facilitators of that effort. So we also went to the international institutions, multilateral institutions, the UN, trusted the institutions, trusted the process, and made sure that our priorities were reflected on that stage. It is sad for us that today the UN is seen as hugely, the UN system and its institutions, ineffective in dealing with different kinds of challenges and emergencies that we face. And I think it is upon all of us to start talking and engaging in productive, serious debates on how to reform the UN system and making it more effective. I agree with this.
And that's a perfect ending for my next question. That is actually for Dr. Conway. Because prior to being Prime Minister, you were a Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, and you are also a strategic advisor to the UN Secretary. So, how do you see the UN system as unfold today? So it's seen as highly non-functional, but how do you set that piece? And what are we going to take to fix it? What are you breaking?
What is dysfunctional is the political part. I mean, the UN is a vast system with a core mechanism, the Security Council, with a huge democratic deficit. The Security Council with 5 veto members. And if one of those members says no, the rest of the membership, 193 countries, can say yes, but that one veto, you can't get it done, right? And if that is the relationship between the 5 Security Council members, as we know, is increasingly dysfunctional. They're unable to produce anything else. And we see today that thing about the Israeli Gaza, they were unable to come up with anything. They're unable to come up with it. It's increasingly provocative missile launches by North Korea, for example. So yes, and there have been, periods where members try to introduce Security Council reform to make it more democratic, make it more representative of the world today, and not the world of 1945 when it was made. They all got nowhere because at the end, they themselves have to go along. They themselves have to say yes. And I don't think at this point, none of the 5 veto voting members are willing to dilute that power. So and that's the reality, but you don't then underestimate the work that's being done by the other parts of the system. Humanitarian assistance, without the UN's humanitarian assistance setup, where would all these I have 330 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, including 100 million people displaced. And the numbers keep growing. And that makes me sad because humanitarian crisis, in a way, is the consequence of political failure. Yeah. The inability to prevent conflicts, the inability to stop conflicts. And therefore you have these huge numbers of people living on humanitarian assistance for all life. Right. And so, but yes, that we somehow the global community needs to shrink that number, but it keeps growing. And there is the UN, the humanitarian work that's being done. And then there are also specialized agencies that's absolutely necessary to the well-being of humanity, the WHO. During the COVID-19 crisis, there were some, the response of the WHO was not entirely satisfactory to the whole of the global community, but it does absolutely vital work for public health. And so don't underestimate, don't throw the baby out, because there are critical work that the UN is doing. The Human Rights Office is holding up its flag to make sure that the human rights standards are not forgotten in all of these responses. And so, yeah, I was in the Human Rights Office and then the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance Office. So that's where my experience comes from. But ultimately, it's the membership. It's they are the decision maker. They are the primary stakeholders. And it's the member states that then have to find a way to. I don't have hope about the Security Council. I think that's a lost cause. But then work with the rest of the system. Work with the great professionals in the UN system to mobilize the best of their talents to deliver for humanity.
And shouldn't we, then you have experience from the Security Council, shouldn't we just move everything to the General Assembly? Why not have a more democratic process in the General Assembly rather than the Security Council?
But we heard that actually the non-permanent members can also play a role if they decide to come together. So we use that a lot during our period of student policy, and definitely try the route of engaging the assembly as well. Because you sometimes need to find sort of your best friends and allies and see what we can shape the relation of that. I think we demonstrated also that when we become our ministers, there are three things that are you. The things that you inherit from your predecessor, the things that you want to do, and the things that happen. And it means that if the always set it up the most difficult, because we have every day something happens in the world. But we are all and the foreigners, we believe in multilateralism. We understand that there is no other way than to cooperate. All of these problems and challenges are global. They know almost no borders, and so they travel geography and time in a way that we've never seen before. And that's why we have to come together. So we have to try all different fields. There are some new ideas. I think it is Liechtenstein that came up with some ideas as well, that we move things forward. Because, for example, sanctions, to decide on sanctions against countries that it's really, but there are ways to move around it. I think the most realistic idea is actually expanding the Security Council. So increase the number of members in the Security Council to make sure that the representativity is better and the efficiency is also.
I know that we have some questions in the audience, among members of our youth branch, and I would like to give the word to Matisse first of all. I don't know whether you can speak up or we'll try the.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll speak up. The first question I would like to ask you is actually about Danish foreign policy, and because I think it's a debate that maybe is relevant also for other, not just European countries, but countries around the world. Yes. So, as you all know, at least, and I guess you do as well, the Danish foreign minister put forward a strategy for Danish foreign policy under the slogan "pragmatic idealism," and with the central argument that Denmark can no longer sustain a foreign policy where the promotion of human rights and democracy is in and of a goal in and of itself. At least that's how I read it. So do you think that Denmark and other European countries around the world must abandon or stow away their value-based idea of foreign policy?
Well, I think that, well, in the case of Mexico, we have in our constitution, we have a written constitution, and in our constitution, we have principles of foreign policy. There are the traditional principles, non-intervention, respect for human rights and promotion of human rights, not using the threat of violence or war to pursue your foreign policy, etc. And the last one we incorporated was the promotion and defense of human rights. And actually, I teach a class at the university in Mexico with regards to the principles of foreign policy. And I think foreign policy should always be guided by principles, but also by interests. And they are not at war with each other. Any country's interests at any given time should be promoted. That's why we use foreign policy, but and the principles should be interpreted accordingly to each circumstance. I don't think you can do any type of politics or policy without principles, but I also think that countries have to promote their own interests and do that within a framework of values and principles, and in our case, democratic and liberal values and principles. That's why we're so worried about the challenge to the rule-based order that we have built in the past decades.
I think I completely agree with Claudia on, based on, you have to have principles, and as liberal democracies, I think our principles and the values that we live by and try to share are basically the same. But to do a values-based foreign policy, you have to realize those values yourself in the first instance. Otherwise, it's not relevant. I think Margot was able to do feminist foreign policy because feminism is pretty well established in Sweden. I thought of introducing that into my own country, and I made the conclusion with this is premature. This would not fly in Korea. So you have to. Yeah, I also consider myself a pragmatist, but with an ideal. But I think foreign policy is fundamentally about being pragmatic and realistic. But you have to have that guiding light, your ideal, and the principles that guide it. But on an everyday basis, as you roll out your foreign policy, you have to be nuanced. You have to know your counterpart. I don't think you can't force those principles, for example, on North Korea to introduce human rights is a great idea because it's one. But how do you then go about promoting that? Naming and shaming is one way, and I think Bailey would take that approach. I don't think that should be the only approach. You have also to find a way to engage them on human rights, in a way that opens up their willingness to listen to you. So you can't expect your partner to go from minus 20 degrees on human rights to 20 degrees overnight. So that I think is what to me is pragmatic idealism, and I certainly hope that Denmark and many countries of this part of the world that have been the models of values-based diplomacy and foreign policy will continue on that road.
And then
It's like being a very young.
Lucas or Peter, will you start that?
So first and foremost, it's wonderful to have such a distinguished panel to ask questions to. One thing that got me thinking is that we are increasingly in a world with both military tensions, global warming, and general externalities that are affecting not just policymakers but also normal everyday people. And a question that we got from the rest of the youth organization I thought was very interesting, which asks, with these kind of crises approaching, how can global civil society expect these issues to be handled in a very polarized foundation? And I think to ask you as previous foreign ministers also, can we engage with global civil society in better ways than we're doing now? And if so, how? Is bottom-up approaches? Do we need more? I think feminist foreign policy is a great example of incorporating civil society into policy making, but do we need more of those kind of political innovations in foreign policy? Thank you.
Yeah, I think we both must and can do that. And I think that we can learn the example of what can happen today with a 15-year-old starting from the schools, right, sitting alone outside the parliament in Sweden, and maybe local movement. So Fridays for Future has been Ukraine as well. When I was there recently, I went with them, and of course, insisting that the grown-ups have to, the adults have to take some responsibility. I am strong in the civil society, maybe because it comes from, you know, I've been back and forth from the environment and actually politics and progress. And I think we need to invite them, but also understand that we have different roles. That we have to respect each other's roles. And I have enjoyed trying to open up also the moral ministry actually to invite also organizations that work on consular cases or that work on a particular country situation and so on. I truly believe in that, and we discuss that before a lot. What do we do with the situation? Because we have a person from Google, and also it's rather scary because she believes that from what we know that this will be the next kind of campaign on social media as well, like the anti-vaccine people and the some speech in also she said. Well, the anti-vaxxers and the all of these movements that go against reason and science and the best of knowledge. And you have a right to your own opinions, but you don't have a right to your own facts. And this is what we said. We also listen to tech companies that they have to check that we provide facts and figures. So.
I don't, in my position as Foreign Minister of the Republic of Korea, I didn't get that many opportunities to engage with the global civil society, but certainly a lot of engagement with the Korean civil society. And I myself have a civil society background prior to becoming a public servant. So I think it's absolutely necessary to give that space to civil society, and it requires the officialdom to really actively reach out rather than then coming knocking on your door. And that's the impression, that's the feeling on their part. We keep knocking on your doors and you're not listening. So the officialdom has to actively open up its door and find a way to engage with civil society. I try very much to do that with the women's rights groups, with human rights groups, with development groups. But that requires extra effort. I mean, it doesn't come naturally with officials.
I just a quick comment on this, and I agree totally with what Margot and you have said right now. But let me remind us all that increasingly civil society has been a part of the UN cluster processes. The construction of the SDGs, for example, the Paris Agreement, the Global Compact on Migration. Civil society participated as vocally in the tables, in the negotiations, putting things on the table, because we've come to realize that governments and states alone cannot tackle by themselves the challenges that we all face as humanity. So we need also the points of view, the agency, the legitimacy, the knowledge that civil society has, and we need to incorporate it to different institutional processes to make sure that the solutions we craft, that the commitments we garner as representatives of the international community are also socially and politically sustainable in time. And that only comes if you incorporate civil society's views to those specific instruments, commitments, or agreements that we draft, and increasingly we see that participation much more actively than in the past.
I think there is a problem now. It's a very role. I really want to know that is that governments, your government, insist on having NGOs represented. I think you have to get right and reduce the participation from civil society organizations. I think this is really bad. This is so bad. So I think that that's what we can And what I think young people have to ask, you know, the good questions to the ministers and the government representatives.
We have time for one final question, and if there's a question from the audience, please. Yeah.
So, very simple question. Is there anywhere where we can look for leadership in the world today? So you see a country, region, person, politician, and business.
Look for women, that's what I think. Look for more women, politics and everywhere, and this is things that I like of.
I think we're all women here, and we, in the Aspens Forum, this is not that exceptional, huh? And they decided to put the three of us here. But we realize there's a huge pushback on women's rights and gender equality, even as we speak, in the UN and in individual countries. And it's hard to find leadership that is upholding these values and truthfulness. And which is why all the more that it is important for every one of us in our own positions to demonstrate the level, the kind of leadership that is truthful, that is bridge building, that is based on facts at every level, at national level, at the UN level, at the local level, as university professors like myself at this point. And so, yes, the one really big lacking at the global level these days is leadership. Democratic systems are not producing the kinds of leaders that we want to see. And so it's the onus on you, the youthful generation, with your voices and your authority rights, to produce that kind of leadership that the countries and the world needs. And in the meanwhile, every one of us, and be a leadership that brings partisanships, you know, that bridges over that.
I mean, we can hide.
Yeah.
We can hide in social media, we can really engage, we need to engage society, understand that we are not individuals to live on our own, we depend on these societies together. So we need more good people in politics, engaged in politics, and we need to sort of take our responsibility also in how we debate with each other. I am very grateful for even entering this debate also in the Middle East, because there are many threats against me that we heard on other sides. And of course, we all condemn what Hamas is doing, and we have been saying that, you know, when we have to enter that debate, you are yourself.
But I would just finish with regards to your question. It is true that in the world stage, we do not have the leaders that in the past we've seen championing the rules-based order, the UN. We don't have Woodrow Wilson and Angela today. And we've seen that, and we see them more in civil society. We see a Greta Thunberg, we see different women like Nadia Murad, and I don't remember the other lady that won with her the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize for their work in eradicating sexual violence in conflict situations. We see civil society speaking up, defending international institutions, but also demanding that the international world order responds to the challenges and emergencies and situations we're seeing everywhere. And I think it's like Margot says, that's an opportunity. Well, it should be a wake-up call for all of us and working public service or having the task, but it's also an opportunity to have the leaders of the future that will emerge also from these other areas and not traditional, and not having the traditional pathway that leads to politics, but that are leaders of their own, and then enter into politics and become the leaders that we need to champion this system that we want to strengthen, to modernize, we want for it to evolve, but that we need it, and it needs champions, vocal champions at the world stage.
Claudia, Luis,
Nacier.
and Dr. Juan, and Norbert also. I think it's a perfect ending because we are the leaders. Civil society can become leaders in many ways. You all represent, let's say, smaller countries which have taken the lead in areas. So we also have agency. So there's agency on all kinds of levels actually that we have to use in order to create the leadership we want. So I just want to thank you so much for contributing and having this interesting discussion, and good luck in your work.
Thank you.